There are marriages made in love, and marriages made in duty, and then there are marriages made in contempt. Miss Elara Voss understood, on the morning of her wedding, that hers belonged to the last category. The Duke of Ashvale had not looked at her during the ceremony. Not once. He had stood at the altar of St. George's, Hanover Square, as though the whole proceeding were a business arrangement to be endured, his jaw set, his grey eyes fixed somewhere above the congregation's collective heads, on nothing. On air, on a future that clearly did not include her in any meaningful way. When the vicar prompted him to speak his vows, he had spoken them as a man reads a contract aloud, clearly, correctly, and without a single note of feeling. Afterward, in the carriage that carried them north toward Ashvale Park, he had turned to her with the particular coldness of a man who has rehearsed a thing too long to soften it. "I wish to make our arrangement clear, miss," he paused. "My lady. You are now Duchess of Ashvale. The title comes with a house, an income, and certain social expectations. I will fulfill my obligations. But I will not pretend to sentiments I do not possess." He had looked at her then, finally, with those pale, winter-gray eyes. "Never speak to me unless I address you first. That is all I ask." She had not wept. She had not raged. She had looked back at him with the same steadiness she had carried through every hard year of her life, and she had said, quietly, "As you wish, your grace." What he did not know, what he could not have known because he had never once troubled himself to look, was that Elara Voss was not what he had dismissed her as. And what neither of them could have known was that before the year was finished, another man would kiss her hand in the shadows of the East Corridor, and the Duke of Ashvale would feel, for the first time in a decade, something that terrified him far more than any battlefield had. The match had been arranged by their respective solicitors, which should have told Elara everything. Her father, the late Reverend Jonas Voss of Cambridgeshire, had died 8 months before, leaving behind a modest house, a collection of theological texts, and a single debt of considerable size owed to the estate of the late Duke of Ashvale, the current Duke's father. The debt had been written in such a way that, upon the Reverend's death, it transferred to his eldest child. That child was Elara. She was 24. She was neither beautiful nor plain in any extreme. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn mouth and the particular quality of stillness that comes to people who have spent many years caring for others with insufficient resources. She had nursed her father through his final illness, managed the parish accounts, taught the village children reading on Tuesday mornings, and kept the house on a budget that would have made a London merchant weep. The current Duke of Ashvale, Lord Edmund Carew, was 31, unmarried, in possession of a title and estate that required an heir, and apparently willing to discharge his father's debt in exchange for a wife who would not embarrass him publicly and would not demand emotional labor he was unwilling to provide. His solicitor had called the proposal elegant. Elara's guardian, her elderly uncle, had called it a miracle. Elara had called it nothing at all. She had read the terms, asked 3 practical questions about the quarterly allowance, and signed. She had told herself she was being sensible. She had told herself she was saving herself from a far worse situation. She had not told herself, because it was too painful to examine directly, that she had hoped, briefly, foolishly, that he might at least be kind. The carriage journey to Ashvale Park in Northumberland took 3 days. The Duke rode ahead on horseback after the first evening, citing the need to arrive before her in order to prepare the staff. Elara suspected he simply could not bear 3 days in an enclosed space with a woman he had already decided to ignore. She watched the landscape grow wilder and greener and colder from behind the carriage window and reminded herself that she had survived worse silences than his. Ashvale Park announced itself through the mist like a promise that had gone badly wrong. The house was enormous and grey and absolutely beautiful in the way that neglected great things sometimes are, the bones perfect, the skin suffering. The drive was overgrown. 3 of the first-floor windows were dark with boards where the glass had been removed and not replaced. The rose garden to the east had collapsed entirely into a tangle of bramble and dead wood. The staff assembled at the door numbered 8, where there should have been 30. The Duke stood at the steps and introduced her to the housekeeper, Mrs. Hadlow, without meeting her eyes. He then excused himself to his study. That evening, he sent his valet to inform her that he took his meals privately and would be obliged if the Duchess would do the same. Mrs. Hadlow showed Elara to her rooms, 4 large, cold chambers at the north end of the house, where the carpets had been rolled and stacked against the walls for reasons no one explained. The fireplace worked, barely. The bed was good. There was a writing table and a candle. Ilara sat at the table for a long time after Mrs. Hadlow left. She did not cry. She listened to the wind working its way through the eaves of Ashvale Park, and she thought, with the same clear practicality that had carried her through her father's final weeks, that a house this size with a staff this small and grounds in this condition had not happened overnight. Something had broken here long before she arrived. She opened the writing table's single drawer and found a blank ledger inside. She lit her second candle from the first, drew the ledger toward her, and began to write down everything she had observed since her arrival. It was the first practical decision of her marriage, and it would prove to be the most important one. Winter came early to Northumberland that year. By the third week of October, the moors were locked in a grey frost that did not lift until mid-morning and fell again before 4. Ilara wore 2 wool petticoats and kept her hands near the kitchen fire whenever she could find a reasonable excuse to be there, which, given how quickly she had made herself useful to Mrs. Hadlow and the cook, was frequently. She had learned, through patient, quiet conversation, what had happened to Ashvale Park. The previous Duke had been a gambler. Not spectacularly, not in the London clubs where ruin at least had an audience, but slowly and privately, through poor investments, failed ventures, and the particular stubbornness of a man who believes his next decision will correct all the previous ones. By the time he died, the estate had been stripped to its functional minimum. Staff dismissed. Tenants left without proper management. The home farm barely producing. The roof of the east wing leaking in 4 places. The current Duke had inherited not a legacy but a ruin wrapped in a title. And he had, apparently, responded to this discovery by closing himself into his study, riding his horse at savage hours in all weathers, and communicating with the outside world primarily through terse written correspondence. He had married her, Ilara understood now, not because he wanted a wife, but because the estate needed capital infusion to survive. And her father's debt, forgiven in exchange for the match, had freed enough restricted funds to stabilize the worst of it. She was a financial instrument. An accounting solution. She found this, upon careful reflection, both insulting and clarifying. If she was to survive here, she would have to build her own usefulness out of materials he had not thought to value. She began with the household ledgers. Mrs. Hadlow surrendered them with visible relief, the expression of a competent woman who has been managing a sinking ship without a captain and is grateful for any port in any weather. The numbers were grim but not hopeless. Ilara worked through them by candlelight for 4 evenings, restructuring the domestic budget, identifying where money was hemorrhaging through inefficiency rather than genuine need. She then walked the house, room by room, in a way she suspected no one had done for years. She found 5 rooms that were sealed but perfectly usable. She found a larder full of preserved goods that had not been rotated properly and were being lost to age. She found a linen cupboard in disarray and a still room that had not been touched since the previous Duchess died, 7 years ago, before the old Duke's final decline. The still room stopped her. It was cold and dusty and smelled of dried lavender and something medicinal she could not immediately name. The shelves held glass jars, ceramic pots, bundles of dried herbs tied with ribbon that had faded from blue to gray. There were handwritten recipe books, their spines cracked, their pages fragile and close-written in a woman's careful hand. Ilara stood there in the thin October light that fell through the one small window and felt, for the first time since her arrival, something other than careful numbness. This room had belonged to someone who cared about this place. Who had grown things and preserved things and made remedies and kept records. She cleaned the still room herself, that afternoon and the next morning, before Mrs. Hadlow found her and protested, and then found herself helping instead of protesting. By November, Ilara had also made contact with the tenants. There were 11 tenant families on the Ashvale estate, and not one of them had spoken with anyone from the main house in over a year. She rode out in the company of the estate's single remaining outdoor man, a weathered Northumbrian named Brent, who looked at her with deep suspicion until she asked him 3 intelligent questions about drainage and listened carefully to the answers. After which his suspicion became something closer to cautious respect. The tenants' situations ranged from difficult to genuinely alarming. 2 families had roofs in dangerous condition. 1 family's well had become contaminated. 3 families had unpaid improvements owed to them from agreements made with the previous steward who had since left. She wrote it all down. She brought the documented list to the Duke's study door, knocked, and when the door was not answered, slid the folded pages underneath it. He did not respond. Not in words. But 2 days later, Brent told her quietly that the Duke had ridden to the Mallory farm himself and arranged for the roof repairs. Ilara received this information in silence. She thought about it for a long time before she allowed herself to feel anything like hope, and then she thought better of hope altogether and filed it under useful data instead. By January, Ashvale Park was warmer. Not dramatically so, the east wing remained closed, the ballroom was still a cold cavern of holland-covered furniture, and the Duke still took his meals alone. But the rooms Ilara occupied had been properly rehung with carpets and repaired drapes that Mrs. Hadlow had found in storage. The kitchen was producing better food because Ilara had reorganized the relationships with local suppliers and restarted the kitchen garden's winter beds with the advice of old Brent, who knew this soil the way a physician knows a patient. She had also, quietly, taken in 2 of the tenant children. The Mallory family had 5 children and a mother who had been ill since autumn, a slow chest complaint that did not improve with cold weather. The 2 youngest, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, had been poorly fed and were recovering from the same winter cough that had been making its way through the estate village. Ilara had asked, not commanded, whether the family might be comfortable with the children staying at the park for a few weeks while their mother recovered. They stayed. The girl, Meg, attached herself to Ilara with the complete devotion of a small creature who has found reliable warmth. The boy, Thomas, was shy but curious and spent long hours watching Ilara work at her desk with an expression of such concentrated attention that she eventually set him to copying numbers while she worked, which he found deeply satisfying. The Duke did not know they were in the house for 11 days. When he encountered Thomas in the corridor outside the library, the boy had been exploring with the quiet stealth of someone who has learned that adults do not always welcome questions. The Duke stopped. His expression was not angry. It was simply very blank, in the way of a man who has not been surprised in a long time and finds the experience disorienting. Thomas looked up at him and said, with the directness of a 6-year-old who has been told that the Duke is the most important person in the house and has therefore concluded the Duke should be addressed accordingly. "Are you the one who fixed our roof?" There was a long pause. "I arranged for it to be fixed," the Duke said. "My mum says you're a fair man," Thomas told him gravely. "She says fair men are rare." He then walked away down the corridor with the ledger pages Ilara had set him to carrying, leaving the Duke standing alone in the passage. That evening, for the first time, the Duke sent a note to Ilara's sitting room. It contained 4 words: "Who are these children?" She wrote back 5, "Mallory children. Temporarily placed here." There was no further note. But the next morning, she found that a small rocking horse had been moved from one of the sealed rooms and left, without explanation or attribution, outside the door of the room where Meg and Thomas slept. Ilara looked at that rocking horse for a long time. Then she went back to her ledgers. Spring arrived the way it always does in the north, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with warmth and frost alternating like an argument between 2 equally stubborn parties. The garden began to show signs of something that could, with effort, become an actual garden again. Ilara spent her mornings outside when the weather permitted, learning from Brent, directing the 2 additional men she had persuaded the Duke's solicitor to authorize on the basis of a detailed economic argument she had written out in full and slid under the study door. She had never once been invited through that door. She had never once been addressed by its occupant in anything other than a written note. She had grown, she realized, quite good at communicating through closed doors. She was less certain she wished to remain good at it forever. It was on a Thursday afternoon in late March that she first heard him play the piano. She had not known he played. She had not thought of him as someone who would play, he seemed too locked inside himself for anything so vulnerable as music. But the sound came through the closed music room door as she passed, unmistakable and arresting, a Beethoven sonata. Played with technical precision and something underneath the precision that was not quite pain but was in that territory. She stood in the corridor and listened for 7 minutes before she forced herself to walk on. She did not speak of it to anyone. He returned in April. Which is to say, the Duke of Ashvale emerged from his self-imposed isolation and began, cautiously, to be present in his own house again. It started with meals. He sent a note one Wednesday morning that he would be dining in the main dining room that evening and expected his wife to be present. Ilara received this note, recognized it for what it was, neither an invitation nor an apology, simply a command dressed in neutral language, and prepared accordingly. She wore her second-best dress, arranged her hair with more care than usual, and arrived in the dining room 3 minutes before the appointed hour. He was already there. He stood when she entered, which surprised her. The dinner was not comfortable. They spoke, when they spoke at all, about the estate. He asked about the tenant improvements in the direct. Efficient way of someone who has clearly been reading the reports she had been quietly compiling and does not wish to acknowledge that he has been reading them. She answered with equal directness and efficiency. When he expressed surprise at the cost reductions in the household budget, she explained her methods briefly and without inflection. He looked at her across the table as though seeing her properly for the first time, and she met his gaze steadily and gave him nothing he had not earned. After dinner, he said, stiffly, "The house is in better condition than I expected." "I am gratified you find it so, Your Grace." A pause. "The Mallory children are still here." Mrs. Mallory recovers slowly. "I did not think it right to return them prematurely." Another pause, longer. "No," he said finally. "I suppose not." He went back to his study. But he began to dine with her regularly after that. The children were the unexpected bridge. Thomas had developed an uncanny ability to appear wherever the Duke was, as if by coincidence. And the Duke had developed an equally uncanny inability to simply ignore a 6-year-old who looked at him with transparent, uncomplicated admiration. He began speaking to Thomas with a stiffness that slowly, over the course of 3 weeks, became something warmer. He found a book of illustrated natural history in the library and left it, with no note, outside the room where the children slept. Meg gave him a drawing she had made of a horse. He kept it. Ilara saw it later, folded carefully, in the breast pocket of his riding coat. She did not comment on it. But she noticed. It was on an evening in early May, when the light was still good past 7 and the garden had begun to look like something she had imagined it could become. That she saw him standing at the window of the study, watching her work among the rose beds below. When she looked up, he did not look away. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds before stepping back into the room. Ilara returned to her work. Her hands were steady. Her heart was slightly less so. The man's name was Lord Geoffrey Vane, and he arrived uninvited on a Tuesday with 2 horses, a letter of introduction from a mutual acquaintance of the previous Duke, and the easy confidence of someone who has never had good reason to doubt his welcome. He was handsome in a practiced way and charming in a way that Ilara recognized immediately as requiring constant maintenance. He was also, she gathered within 20 minutes of his arrival, deeply interested in the eastern portion of the Ashvale estate, specifically the tenanted farmland near the ridge that old Brent had told her was the best-yielding soil in Northumberland. The Duke received Lord Vane with correct but restrained courtesy. Lord Vane responded to the Duke's coldness by directing most of his attention to Ilara, which was either a social miscalculation or a deliberate tactic, and she suspected the latter. Over the dinner that she had arranged with her usual competent precision, Vane spoke with apparent warmth about the improvements he could see the estate had undergone, complimented the food, asked intelligent questions about the garden, and spoke to Ilara as though she were the primary intelligence behind the household, which, of course, she was. But which most men in Vane's position would not have been gracious enough to observe openly. She was polite. She was careful. She watched the Duke watching Lord Vane and saw, for the first time, something move across the controlled, gray-eyed face that was not annoyance. The following afternoon, she was crossing the east corridor toward the still room when Vane appeared at the far end, having apparently come from the direction of the locked estate rooms without invitation. He walked toward her with the easy pace of a man who does not believe in closed doors. "My lady," he said, and took her hand before she could properly offer it, and bent over it with a slowness that was clearly meant to be observed. What he did not know, because he had not looked, was that the Duke was standing in the shadowed alcove of the corridor door, 3 feet behind Ilara's shoulder, completely still. She felt it before she saw it. The quality of the air changed. She straightened, withdrawing her hand from Vane's with the clean finality of a woman who does not need to make a scene to make a point, and turned. The Duke was looking at Lord Vane with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not anger, precisely. It was something older than anger, and colder, and far more complicated. "Lord Vane," he said, with a quiet that was louder than a raised voice. "I believe you have lost your way. The guest rooms are in the West Wing." Vane left the following morning. No one asked him to stay. He did not argue. That afternoon, the Duke came to the garden where Ilara was cutting back the early roses, the first real harvest of the season. He stood at the garden's edge and watched her for a moment before he spoke. "Are you well?" he asked. It was the first time he had asked her that. In 7 months of marriage, it was the first time he had asked. She looked at him over the roses, her gardening gloves still on, a stem in her hand. "Yes," she said. "Thank you for asking, Your Grace." He nodded, once, like a man acknowledging a debt he is not certain how to pay. Then he said, "I saw. I know you did. He is not a good man." "No," she agreed. "He is not. He also wants the Ridge farmland, and I suspect the letter of introduction was manufactured. You should ask your solicitor to look into it." He stared at her. Not with condescension, but with the arrested expression of someone who has made a serious misjudgment and is only now beginning to understand its magnitude. "You already suspected," he said. "I suspected the moment he arrived." She set down the rose stem. "He wanted me to feel flattered. Flattered women are easier to use as leverage." Another long silence. The garden held its breath around them. "I will write to the solicitor today," the Duke said. "I know you will," said Ilara, and went back to her roses. He found her in the still room on a Sunday evening, 2 weeks after Vane's departure. She was working by candlelight, transcribing from the old recipe books into a fresh one she had bought from the village, creating a new record of what could be preserved, what could be grown. What remedies had worked for which ailments among the estate's people. It was quiet work, precise work, the kind of work that required a specific kind of peace to do well. He knocked at the still room door, which she found, in retrospect, remarkable. He had not previously been in the habit of knocking. She said, "Come in," and he came, and he stood in the doorway of the small room with his hands at his sides, looking at the shelves and the jars and the books with an expression she recognized from the Mallory rocking horse. Some old emotion he had not expected to encounter and did not quite know what to do with. "This was my mother's room," he said. She set her pen down carefully. "I thought it might have been." He stepped inside, slowly, and looked at the labels on the jars. Lavender. Rosehip. Willow bark. His mother's writing, faded but legible. He reached out and touched one of the jars without picking it up, just touched it, with 2 fingers, briefly. "She died when I was 14, he said. "After that, my father," he stopped. He seemed to be choosing between versions of the truth and finally settling on a simpler one. "After that, nothing in this house worked correctly." "I know," she said. "I read her recipe books. She was very particular about what worked and what was mere tradition. She tested things." He looked at her. "You read them?" "All 3 of them." She was an intelligent woman. He was quiet for a long time. Then, with the difficulty of a man who has not said a true thing about himself in years, "I thought, when I married, that I was protecting this estate. That I was being rational. That feelings were," he stopped again. "My father felt a great deal and it destroyed everything he touched." "Your father's feelings were not the problem," Ilara said, with a gentleness she had not intended and could not quite take back. "His choices were." He looked at her as though she had said something in a language he had believed extinct. "I gave you nothing," he said. "When you arrived. I gave you a cold house and a ledger and silence." "You gave me a house that needed work," she said. "That was more useful than you know." "That is not," he exhaled. "That is not forgiveness, Ilara." It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it move through her like the first genuine warmth of a February that has gone on too long. She did not let it show, because she was not ready to let it show, because there were still things between them that a single conversation in a still room could not resolve. "No," she agreed. "It is not. But it is a start, if you are prepared to be honest about what you did and why." He was quiet for a long moment, and she let the quiet exist without filling it. Because she had learned something valuable in 7 months of a silent marriage. Sometimes the only honest thing a person can offer is the willingness to stay in the room with an uncomfortable truth until it is finished with you. I was afraid, he said finally, roughly, like a word dragged up from somewhere he hadn't been in years. I didn't know how not to be. And so I closed everything that could be closed. Including me. Including you. A pause. I was wrong. She looked at him for a long moment in the candlelight, with the smell of old lavender and new ink around them and the wind off the moor pressing quietly at the small window. Yes, she said. You were. She picked up her pen again. She did not dismiss him. She did not invite him to stay. She let him choose. He pulled a stool from the corner, the one she used to reach the upper shelves, and he sat on it, and he remained in the still room while she worked. And they were quiet together in a way that was entirely unlike the silence of the past 7 months. It was not the silence of walls. It was the silence of two people deciding, carefully, to inhabit the same space. The storm came in June, swift and brutal, the way northern storms sometimes do, arriving within an hour of a clear sky. Announcing itself with a wind that made the window frames shriek and the old trees in the West Park bend dangerously low. Thomas had been outside. Elara knew this because Meg told her, from the corridor, in the high, thin voice of a child who has realized something is very wrong. Thomas went to see the horses. He went before the sky went bad. The stables were a quarter-mile from the house, beyond the garden wall. Along a path that ran beside the stream that in fine weather was pleasant and in a storm like this would run fast and cold and angry. She was already moving when the Duke appeared at the top of the stairs. Thomas, she began. I heard. He was already reaching for his coat from the hall stand. He looked at her, at the cloak she was pulling around her shoulders, and for one moment she thought he would tell her to stay inside, that this was not her concern. That she had no place in the rain and the dark. She braced herself for it. Can you ride? He said instead. Yes. Then come. They found Thomas 20 minutes later, which was 20 minutes of fear she had not permitted herself to express and which she could feel, nonetheless. In her throat and her hands. He had been smarter than they'd feared. When the storm broke, he had sheltered in the lee of the old hay barn halfway between the house and the stables. In a gap between the wall and a stack of timber that was perfectly sized for a small, frightened, resolute 6-year-old. He was soaked and shaking and furious at himself in the way of children who know they have done something foolish and are too proud to cry about it. The Duke dismounted before his horse had entirely stopped, which Elara noted as the action of a man who moves on instinct when something important is at stake, not calculation. He crouched down in front of Thomas and looked at him in the lightning-broken dark. Are you hurt? He said. No, sir. Thomas's teeth were chattering. I stayed out of the water. Good. He removed his own coat and put it around Thomas's shoulders, a coat that was nearly as big as the boy and wrapped around him twice. That was good thinking. They rode back through the rain, Thomas in front of Elara on her horse, wrapped in the Duke's coat, gradually stopping shivering. When they reached the house, the Duke lifted the boy down himself, carried him inside while Elara saw to the horses with Brent, who had appeared from the stables with a lantern and the expression of a man who has seen storms enough to know this one would pass. When Elara came inside, wet through and pushing her hair from her face, she found the Duke in the kitchen with Thomas, who was wrapped in a blanket before the range and drinking something hot. And Meg pressed against the Duke's side with the unself-conscious trust of a child who has decided that adults who bring rocking horses are fundamentally reliable, and the Duke had his hand, lightly, carefully, on Meg's small dark head. He looked up at Elara. The kitchen was warm. The storm beat at the window. Outside, everything was dark and wild and unreasonable. Inside, it was not. He said, quietly, across the kitchen and the steam and the distance of everything they had not yet said, they're all right. Yes, she said. They are. She sat down at the kitchen table, still in her wet cloak, and accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Hadlow, who had the wisdom not to say anything at all. Thomas fell asleep within 10 minutes. Meg followed shortly after. The Duke did not leave the kitchen. He sat across from Elara at the table while the storm ran its course, and they talked, for the first time, quietly and continuously, without agenda, about small things and then larger ones. About Thomas's quick mind and what might be done for his schooling, about the ridge farmland and what Vane had actually wanted. About the solicitor's report that had indeed found the letter of introduction to be a fabrication connected to a land scheme of some scope. And then, because it was late and they were tired and the defenses that exhaustion dismantles are often the most important ones, she told him about her father's last winter, the long illness. The cold house, the way she had managed everything and felt nothing, because there had not been time for feeling until after. He listened. He did not offer sympathy in the performance way. He simply listened, which was what she needed. "You've been managing alone for years," he said, when she had finished. "Yes." "Before you came here, even." "Yes." He was quiet, looking at his hands on the table. "I made it worse." "You could make it better now," she said. It was not a command and not a plea. It was an observation, clear as arithmetic, offered in the same tone she had used in the garden over the roses. He looked at her. "I intend to," he said. "If you will let me." July brought the solicitor north, bearing papers. There was the matter of the Vane scheme, which was larger than anticipated and connected to 2 other northern estates that had been quietly acquired under pressure after manufactured debts were introduced, the same technique. Ilara realized with a cold clarity that had been used on her father. When she told the Duke this, sitting across from him in the study she had entered for the first time in 9 months of marriage, he was very still for a long moment. "Your father's debt to my father," he said slowly. "I don't know," she said. "But I think it worth examining." He examined it. The solicitor examined it. What they found was not the clear evidence of deliberate fraud, it was old and tangled and the original parties were dead, but there was enough irregularity to suggest that the Reverend Voss had been guided into a position of indebtedness he had not entirely understood. By men who understood it very well. The Duke did not speak for some time after the solicitor left. Then he said, "You came here because of a debt that may not have been legitimate." "I came here because there was no alternative," Ilara said. "The debt was real enough by the time it reached me." "And you never," he stopped. "You never said." "I only understood it fully last week, when I saw the pattern." He stood and walked to the window where she had seen him watching her in the garden. He looked out at it now, the garden that was nothing like it had been when she arrived, green and ordered and alive with early summer color. "I owe you more than I can repay," he said, to the window. "You owe me honesty," she said. "And presence. And the willingness to be here, in this house, with me. That is what I want. Not restitution." He turned from the window. He looked at her with the unguarded look she had first seen in the still room, the look that did not have any performance in it, any management or control, just a man. Frightened and grateful and sorry in a way that had clearly been building for a long time. "I told you never to speak to me," he said. "On the day we were married. I said it as if you were less than the least of what I needed." He crossed the room toward her, slowly, and stopped a foot away. "And then you took everything I had abandoned, everything I had given up on, and he searched for the word. You answered it. You answered this house. You answered these people. You answered a silence I didn't know I'd been making for years." She held his gaze. "Edmund," she said, using his name for the first time, a small and enormous thing. "I did not answer your silence. I answered my own nature. I needed a home to manage because I had always managed homes. I needed people to care for because caring is what I know how to do." She paused. "But I want this one. I want this home. I want to stay here and build it into what it could be. And I want to do that with you beside me, not locked behind a study door." He reached out and took her hand. Not in the way Lord Vane had taken it, as a demonstration, a performance meant to be observed. Quietly, carefully, with the full weight of what he was asking in the pressure of his fingers. "Will you let me try?" he said. "Properly. From the beginning, if you are willing." She looked at their joined hands. She thought about the cold carriage journey, the boarded windows, the 8-member staff, the silent dining, the notes slid under doors. The still room and the rocking horse and the storm and the kitchen table and the months of careful work in rooms he had not bothered to enter. "I am not the woman you thought you married," she said. "No," he said. You are considerably more. And you are not entirely the man I feared you were. I am trying not to be. His grip on her hand was steadier now. I failed you at the beginning. I cannot undo that. But I do not intend to fail you again. She was quiet for a moment, which he had by now learned to read correctly, not as withdrawal, but as thought. As the considered weight she gave to anything that mattered. Then we begin again, she said. Without conditions. Without instructions about who may speak and when. His mouth moved, not quite a smile, but in that direction, something that was learning, perhaps, to become one. Without conditions, he agreed. Thomas and Meg Mallory returned home to their mother in August, who had recovered well and was tending her kitchen garden with a vigor that Alara had been quietly supporting with herbs from the still room and guidance from her own growing knowledge. The parting with the children was tender and practical in equal measure. Meg cried, Thomas did not, but was very quiet for an hour. And the Duke rode to the Mallory farm with them himself and stayed long enough to discuss with their father a proper schooling arrangement for Thomas, whose quick mind was. The Duke had decided privately and then aloud, too good to waste. He told Alara about the conversation that evening over dinner, their dinner, in the dining room they shared without ceremony now, and she listened with the expression he had come to look for. That particular quality of attention she gave to things that genuinely moved her, which was different from politeness and entirely unmistakable. You'll make a good patron, she said. I had a good example, he said. She reached across the table and set her hand, briefly, over his. The autumn came early again that year, as it always did in the north. The moors turned amber and rust in a deep, sad purple that was nevertheless somehow beautiful. The garden was properly put to bed for winter, the bulbs planted, the roses cut back correctly. The house had a full staff now, not 30, perhaps, but 18 good people who worked with efficiency and something that had begun to resemble happiness, or at least its practical cousin, security. Alara and the Duke walked the grounds on a Sunday morning in late September, the way they had begun to do regularly, her arm in his, both of them in heavy coats against the wind off the moor. They had developed a language between them built of observations and quiet arguments and the occasional silences that were no longer walls but simply breathing spaces. He stopped at the top of the rise that looked back at the house. Ashvale Park in the early autumn light, the stone warm, the windows clear, smoke rising from 3 chimneys, the garden a tidy patchwork below. I nearly lost all of this, he said. Before you came. You had already lost it, she said, gently. I only found it again. He looked at her, at the dark eyes and the stubborn mouth and the stillness that had so thoroughly deceived him at the beginning into thinking her lesser than she was. I said never speak to me, he said. And you did not. You simply did everything else instead. It seemed the more practical approach. He lifted her hand and held it, not like a man conducting a formal gesture, but like a man who has learned to recognize what he would be without what he is holding. He brought it to his lips, her hand, her cold fingers, and pressed his mouth there with all the sincerity of an apology that had been finding its way toward expression for the better part of a year. Thank you, he said, for not going. She looked at the house they had built together out of ruin and silence and stubborn, patient, practical love. The smoke rose straight in the still morning air. The windows caught the light. I never intended to, she said. And so it was that Ashvale Park came back to life, not through the grand gestures of a repentant duke, but through the steady, patient work of a woman who understood that love, like an old house, is not restored in a single afternoon but in 1,000 small mornings, each one chosen again. If this story moved you, if Alara's quiet strength and Edmund's slow reckoning reached something in your heart, please do leave a like and share this with someone who loves a romance that earns its ending. Subscribe so you never miss a new story. We will be here, with another tale of resilience, dignity, and love that takes its time. Because the best ones always do.